Okay, so I want to briefly talk to you about where it all started, the history of AI. We're going to give you a few different segments. I highly recommend going and researching a little bit more yourself. But we'll start in 1950. In 1950, there was a gentleman named Alan Turing, and he created the Turing test. When he did this, he speculated about the possibility of creating machines that think. This could be said to be the first time we've truly started to think about this idea of intelligent machines. And it wasn't long after that in 1956 we saw the Dartmouth Summer Research Project. Now, the Dartmouth Summer Research Project was led by John McCarthy, and he got himself and a lot of his reputable colleagues together, and they started and named the field of artificial intelligence. They used this quote to proceed on the basis of conjecture that every aspect of learning or any other feature of intelligence can in principle be so precisely described that a machine can be made to simulate it. And so this was the original definition of AI, and we know that AI has changed almost its expectations and its definitions over time. So let's take a look at a little bit further on in the AI cycle. So from around this time, 1956, all the way up to the mid-70s, this was where we saw the gold rush of AI. This was where research was being extremely well funded, optimism was through the roof, and everyone was really excited about what this new type of technology, this idea of intelligent machines, could start to do. Some of the good examples include things like Shaky, the robot, who was able to maneuver and make logical reasoning tasks. We also saw what you could call the first chatbot, called Eliza, and Eliza was able to converse with people, and people thought that they were talking to a human. We also had things like Bloxworld and all sorts of other different new AI ventures. But unfortunately, it didn't last too long. Through the mid-70s into the early 80s, we saw an AI winter. Now, in research, a winter means that funding stops being given, so ceases to exist, and unfortunately, optimism is lowered on what is actually possible. This can happen for many different reasons. Let's explore a couple of them. So these four symbols show some of the issues that might have come up during that AI winter. So one being compute power, the limited compute power that we had in the mid-70s to 80s. Then also looking at combinatorial explosion. So this idea of the amount of parameters or the amount of options that need training in an artificial intelligence agent. This was too much given the power, and also when we start to really optimize algorithms, we start to see better choices of combinatorial explosion. We then start looking at the data. We take advantage so much right now of how much data we have available, data we can create even. At the time, there was not as much digital data, and this did hinder the process of creating some powerful algorithms. And then finally, framing the problem. So thinking about the question that we're going to ask of the AI. Were we asking the right questions? Were they narrow enough? Because we know that AI can be incredibly good at one thing. It was also during this AI winter and with these issues that we saw quite a lot of criticism of approaches. So we burst through with huge optimism, but sometimes we do have to critique each other's work so that we can continue to progress. At the time, there was criticisms on the Turing test by John Searle and his Chinese room theory, but there was also criticisms based on things like Eliza being the first chatbot, and whether it was ethical what Eliza was doing in all the different forms that it was available. During this time, and as we progress forward, Marvin Minsky was known for talking a lot about Scruffy versus neat AI. So neat AI being this idea that you have lots of different options and trees and logical reasoning behind the applications of AI that you would build. Scruffy AI became something slightly different. It was this first idea that you have an object, they describe it as a small bird. If you have a bird, there's this whole world that lives around this bird, all the different things that you associate with birds or that bird would associate with life. And that was the idea that people started to build. They built them into something called scripts or frames, and interestingly enough, it's said that this type of technology actually led to some progressions in object-oriented programming. Into the 1980s, we were starting to get somewhere in production. Expert systems were becoming really popular because they became the focus of AI, given their huge business impact. People were saving millions, and they were finding it incredibly useful to their business processes. This was also the time, probably a little bit more behind the scenes in research, that there was the revival of something called Connectionism. Now, myself and you, we might know Connectionism actually by a better name now, which is the application of neural networks. So things like Hopfield net, backpropagation, and applying these different processes to neural networks was a real step forward and something that was being revisited. Just before the early 90s, AI hit another cold wind, let's call it maybe, over an AI winter, in the sense that these expert systems that were showing such value for large business were actually really struggling now to maintain them. The hardware was really specialised, and this was at a time where we were democratising other technologies. So we were starting to say things like a personal computer on everyone's desk, and all sorts of other things in the space as well, that actually it was all about giving it to everyone and not keeping it for certain people. During this time and in the 90s, we started to find that a lot of different AI approaches would come out of things with faces or things with human-like appearances. This was the promise of AI, the introduction of robotics. And we started to see everything that came out of AI felt like it had to have a face, which was not always the case, and we know that now, that it doesn't necessarily have to have a face to be incredibly powerful. And during this time where we saw AI with a face, we also started to see all of those issues that we described in that first AI winter coming into fruition. We have much larger scale compute power, we have an excessive amount of data, we're getting better at framing the exact question that we want our AI to answer, and we have algorithms that are getting incredibly optimized for different approaches that you're going to use. And so all of these things meant we can keep pushing forward with AI projects. And so we kind of get to the now, and I have these pictures of jigsaw pieces because artificial intelligence started as a single area. Over time, it's broken down into different jigsaw pieces or different segments. That means different parts of the AI spectrum can be focused on in a certain way. It also means, if you ever heard it, if someone says, oh, someone's an expert in AI, they probably absolutely are. But one of the interesting things is, what specific parts of AI have they been working in? Because they all follow and all cross-collaborate across the different areas. Sometimes AI can feel like too much of a broad term, and so these jigsaw pieces have helped us really understand what's possible with AI. And so in this segment, I've taken you on a really whirlwind tour. I highly recommend going and researching the history of AI yourself. It's fascinating. So now we've talked about where it's come from, I'm thinking we're going to go and explore a little bit more about what it actually is, AI.